For everyone who solves crime from their couch, knows more about forensics than their own job, and has trust issues with small-town sheriffs, Amazon Music's millions of podcast episodes are calling. Just download the Amazon Music app and start listening to your favorite true crime podcasts ad-free. Included with Prime.
AI agents are everywhere, automating tasks and making decisions at machine speed. But agents make mistakes. Just one rogue agent can do big damage before you even notice. Rubrik Agent Cloud is the only platform that helps you monitor agents, set guardrails, and rewind mistakes, so you can unleash agents, not risk. Accelerate your AI transformation at Rubrik.com. That's RUBRIK.com.
Hey listeners, this is Peter and welcome back to the History Shorts podcast. This humble show is brought to you by the Podcast Republic, your ultimate listening app. Discover and subscribe to thousands of podcasts from around the world, including this one, and all in one place. Download Podcast Republic now, available on Google Play and the Apple App Store. Today on History Shorts. He was 24 years old, a reluctant soldier, and the only American executed for desertion during World War II. This is the haunting story of Private Eddie Slovik, the man the U.S. Army decided to make an example of.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
Edward Donald Slovik was not a born soldier. In fact, he was barely a soldier at all. Born in Detroit, Michigan in 1920, Slovik grew up poor, the son of Polish immigrants trying to make a life in the industrial Midwest. His youth was marked by petty crime and instability. By his late teens, he'd already served time in reform school and prison for theft and car-related offenses. But in 1942, the same year that millions of young men were being drafted to fight overseas, Slovik was still on probation, legally ineligible for military service. He married Antoinette Vinevsky, a quiet, devout girl from his neighborhood. The couple dreamed of a simple life, a home, steady work, and a family. But in 1944, as the war dragged on and manpower shortages grew desperate, the U.S. Army began drafting men with prior convictions. Slovik's luck had run out. He was sent to Camp Walters, Texas, for basic training. From the start, he was terrified, not of the enemy, but of war itself. "I'm not cut out for this," he told his fellow recruits. "I can't kill anyone." By August 1944, Slovik was shipped to France as part of the 28th Infantry Division, one of the units preparing to push into Germany. But as his group approached the front, the chaos of war intervened. Artillery fire scattered the convoy, and Slovik, along with another soldier, was separated from his unit. For 6 weeks, the two men stayed behind the lines, seeking shelter with a Canadian military police unit. They were eventually returned to their company in October of 1944, but Slovik's fear had hardened into paralysis. He told his commanding officer that he was too frightened to fight. "I'm not a brave man," he admitted. "I just can't do it." The officer warned him that refusing combat was the same as desertion, a capital offense in wartime. Still, Slovik refused. He asked to be transferred to a non-combat assignment, anything that would keep him from the front lines. His request was denied. So, in a decision that would seal his fate, Eddie Slovik walked away from his unit. Unlike most deserters, Slovik didn't try to hide it. He approached a military cook and handed over a handwritten confession. "I, Private Eddie D. Slovik, confess to the desertion of the United States Army. I'll run away again if I have to get out of here." The Army officers who read the note didn't know what to make of it. Normally, deserters destroyed evidence. They didn't handwrite confessions. One officer even tried to convince him to take the letter back, to rejoin his unit, to disappear into the system. But Slovik refused. "I made up my mind," he said, "and I'll take my punishment." He was arrested immediately. Slovik's court-martial took place in November of 1944 in the French town of Rotterdam, just across the German border. The proceedings lasted barely 2 hours. He was charged under Article 58 of the Articles of War, desertion in the face of the enemy. The evidence was damning, not because he had been caught, but because he had confessed in writing to everything. His defense attorney, a 24-year-old lieutenant with no prior trial experience, could offer little more than an appeal for mercy. The military panel deliberated less than 2 hours before delivering its verdict: guilty. The sentence: death by firing squad. At the time, 49 other American soldiers had been sentenced to die for desertion, but all had received commutations. Slovik was the only one whose sentence would be carried out. The decision to execute Eddie Slovik came from the highest levels of command. By late 1944, the U.S. Army in Europe was struggling to maintain morale. The fighting in France and Belgium had been brutal, and desertion rates were rising sharply. In December, as the Battle of the Bulge erupted and American lines were pushed to the brink, Supreme Allied Commander General Dwight D. Eisenhower reviewed Slovik's file himself. He approved the sentence. In his memo, Eisenhower wrote that an example must be made. End quote. The Army could not appear weak, not when thousands of men were freezing, dying, and fighting to end the war. Slovik's death, it was reasoned at least, would serve as a deterrent, a grim reminder of the consequences of cowardice. On January 31st, 1945, in a small French village of Sainte-Marie, Eddie Slovik awoke to his final morning. A priest offered him communion. He wrote a letter to Antoinette, his last words to the woman that he had loved and longed for through every fearful night. He asked for her forgiveness and told her he was not afraid to die. At 10 a.m., military police escorted him to a walled courtyard behind a farmhouse. 12 riflemen from the 109th Infantry Regiment stood ready. He was tied to a post, his hands bound behind him. The priest whispered a final blessing. Slovik's last words were quiet. "They're not shooting me for deserting the United States Army. They're shooting me for bread and cheese." It was a Polish saying, meaning they were killing him not for what he'd done, but for what he represented. Moments later, the rifles fired. He was struck 11 times. The army doctor pronounced him dead at 10:04 a.m. Eddie Slovik's body was buried in a military cemetery near Nancy, France, in grave 451, marked only with the number. His widow, Antoinette, learned of his execution by telegram. She spent the rest of her life trying to have his name cleared and his remains brought home. For years, her pleas were ignored. It wasn't until 1977, more than 30 years later, that Slovik's body was finally returned to the United States through the efforts of author William Bradford Hugh and television personality Martin Sheen, who later portrayed him in a dramatization of his life. Slovik was reburied in Detroit's Woodmere Cemetery beside Antoinette, who had never remarried. The execution of Eddie Slovik remains one of the most controversial acts of American military justice. More than 14,000 soldiers were convicted of desertion during World War II, but Slovik alone faced the firing squad. Why him? Well, because he was visible, because he refused, and because the army, facing one of the bloodiest winters in history, needed to prove that discipline would not break, even if compassion had to. Historians have debated whether Slovik was a coward, a victim, or both. To some, he was a man who failed his duty. To others, he was the product of a system that punished fear as if it were betrayal. But perhaps the most haunting part of this story is not that he was executed, but that he expected to be spared. Even as the blindfold was tied over his eyes, he believed that someone would intervene. Someone would say it was all a mistake. No one did. In the decades since his death, Slovik's story has forced generations of Americans to confront uncomfortable questions about justice, mercy, and the meaning of courage. How does a nation built on freedom handle those who falter in its defense? Can fear itself be a crime? As the war raged toward its end, the name Eddie Slovik was quietly erased from official memory. No medals, no memorials, no mention, obviously. But history has a way of remembering what we try to forget. Let me know what you guys think in the comments section of wherever you're listening to this podcast. Hopefully, today's episode has inspired you to seek out and learn more about this subject. For answers to questions, sources for today's episode, to leave a comment, or check out upcoming guest announcements, visit www.historyshortspodcast.com or look for History Shorts Podcast on Facebook, X, or Patreon. Stay curious, and I will talk to you all tomorrow.
Hi, I'm Chris Gethard, and I'm very excited to tell you about Beautiful Anonymous, a podcast where I talk to random people on the phone. I tweet out a phone number, thousands of people try to call, we talk to one of them, they stay anonymous, I can't hang up, that's all the rules. I never know what's going to happen. We get serious ones. I've talked with meth dealers on their way to prison. I've talked to people who survived mass shootings. Crazy funny ones. I talked to a guy with a goose laugh, somebody who dresses up as a pirate on the weekends. I never know what's going to happen. It's a great show. Subscribe today, Beautiful Anonymous.